Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kamel Ayadi. I'm Minister to the Head of the State of Tunisia, in charge of high-level authority on administrative and financial control. It's my great pleasure to be here today as a member of the Board of Directors of the WJP to welcome you all and to introduce Day 3 of our forum. Our theme today is building the movement. A challenge the size of justice gap requires a broad-based coalition to bring the necessary political, financial, and creative resources to bear. We, at the WJP, have always emphasized the multidisciplinary nature of the rule of law project. It's not a matter of judges and lawyers. We are, all of us, stakeholders in the rule of law, including people like me, an engineer by training and by profession. So too, with achieving justice for all. Bridging the justice gap requires global effort and collective actions, as well as collaboration and coalition across sectors and between public and private actors. We need to tap expertise from the fields of finance and social work, technology, and public health. And we need to learn from other broad-based movements, making a chance on issues such as women's rights and environment. This is today's work at the forum. We start with an inspiring panel of global leaders with experience in making a change through multi-stakeholder collaboration. The opening plenary will be followed by a special set of breakout sessions focused on strengthening our communication skills. How can we make a stronger case for justice and draw in the diverse constituency we need for this effort? Following the plenary, during the coffee break, if you haven't yet done so, take a moment to vote for your favorite World Justice Challenge projects in the meeting application. Please keep in mind that voting will close at noon today. The working sessions that follow will address key challenges, such as court digitalization, criminal justice reform, the fairness of justice by algorithm, and regulation of the legal profession to facilitate innovation. On each of these topics, we have much to gain through multi-sectoral, multidisciplinary collaboration. At lunchtime, we have the exciting opportunity to hear from Grammy Award-nominated Nigerian musician Sid Kuti about the important role musicians and artists play as a messenger of justice themes in their communities and around the globe. Then, this afternoon, you are invited to fan out to different locations throughout The Hague, the city of peace and justice, to learn from WJP's many justice partners headquartered here. Buses will be available to take you to each of these locations. Pickup will be at the front entrance here at the conference center at 3 p.m. Conference badges will be required to board these buses and gain access to these off-site locations. So please take those along with you. Following the afternoon sessions, we are all invited by the municipality of The Hague to a reception at the Porchery Studio on The Hague Voorhout, and shuttles will be available to return you to the conference hotels from the city center all evening. So, with that overview, let's get to building the movement. To get us started, let me introduce Sam Muller, CEO of the Hague Institute for Innovation and Law, and a valuable co-producing partner of WJP in this week's forum. You have the floor, please. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Good morning, all you brave people that were able to wake up and be here on time. Collaboration, for me, is what I sometimes call the unusual partnerships that make it happen, that make real change happen. And one of my good friends, Eddie Hartman, one of the co-founders of LegalZoom, has a fantastic PowerPoint slide that he sometimes uses, which always cracks me up. In that slide, he asks how many hospitals and innovative health companies are run exclusively by doctors. And he has a way of an animation on it, which of course ultimately shows that the answer is 0. And yet, in the legal sector, most of our hospitals and innovative health companies are exclusively run by lawyers. Last week, I had a meeting with the Minister of Justice and the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Niger, and we were talking about justice, radicalization, and migration. And it was so obvious from that conversation that to talk about those topics only within the realm of those topics didn't make any sense, but that justice, migration, and radicalization were somehow part of the same conversation, and we had to kind of solve it together. And a last example I'd like to share with you is many conversations that I've had and many with ministers of justice and many national justice strategy plans that I've seen all over the world where the justice sector is one pillar in a national plan. So one pillar builds roads, the other one builds a justice system, the other one builds a health system. But it's almost like, the justice system is an enabler for the rest. So this very pillared approach often doesn't make sense. But we don't really know how to do it differently because most strategies of most ministries of justice are still those pillars where you build more lawyers and more judges and more courts with little relationship with the other objectives that a country has. So that's what we're going to talk about. Sharing examples of collaboration, sharing examples of these unusual partnerships, and what we'd like to do also with you, because at the end I'm going to open the floor for about 15 minutes, is also to look a little bit at the efforts to do that failed, the things that went wrong, and what we could learn from that. We have an amazing panel to help us explore this theme. First, Sandie Okoro, the Senior Vice President and General Counsel of the World Bank, who now works on development, but who has been, who spent most of her professional life, besides doing a lot of voluntary work, in the banking sector. Then we have Thuli Madonsela, a professor now, but a former prosecutor who's worked and has a global reputation on integrity and fearlessness enforcing accountability. And lastly, we have Kavita Ramdas of the Women's Rights Program of the Open Society Foundations, who is a globally recognized advocate for gender equity and justice. You can read more about them in the program. So let's get started. We'd like to start with the why, and maybe I could just do a quick round, starting with you, Kavita. Why would you say it is so necessary to collaborate across sectors?
Well, good morning, first of all. Salam namaste. I'm really pleased to be here and very pleased to be with my colleagues on this panel. I hope you'll note I'm the only non-lawyer on this panel. So we are doing a little cross-sectoral collaboration right here. I actually think that we said this when we were speaking earlier, Sam, the feminist thinker and poet Audre Lorde once said, "We don't live single-issue lives, so how could we possibly have single-issue movements?" And I think many of you will have heard the more complicated term that is associated with that simple statement, which is the word intersectionality. And in fact, I think feminists have given us a great tool to be able to use in terms of thinking about why it is so important. And the why is actually just that simple. We don't, any of us, live lives in which we are simply mothers or simply workers or simply caretakers of elderly people or people who are performing roles in public service. We live in all of those different spaces. And so for me, the understanding of justice must require us to be able to work in a cross-sectoral way, because we simply don't live, as you said, within isolated pillars. In fact, I like to not think about pillars at all. I like to think about baskets, and you can put lots of things in one basket.
Thank you. Thuli, what's your why?
Good morning. Collaboration is important because none of us has the full answer on anything that we work on. We all have our blind spots. Ethiopians say when spider webs combine, they can tie up a lion. But just come to think about a whole lot of things that have been achieved in life. Think about Edmund Hillary climbing Mount Everest. And we attribute that epic achievement to one person. But it took a lot of collaboration to put Edmund Hillary to the top of Mount Everest. And in law, there's always been collaboration. And I can think of one thing that changed the legal landscape. It was the Brandeis Brief. It took sociological, anthropological information and that data to help courts to start thinking about the context within which they are judging and the likely impact of their decision. And that changed the landscape of judging when it comes to thinking about social justice or disparate impact of decisions of judges that on the face they would have looked like they would treat everyone equally. And I think with the world becoming more complex, no discipline can do it alone. We need to collaborate, for example, with AI people as lawyers, and we'll talk about that later. But just lastly to say, in Africa, the notion of Ubuntu was always based on the understanding that to be human is to collaborate. I am because you are alone, I can't do it. I need others to survive. Hence, looking after you is looking after myself. Thank you.
Thank you. Sandie.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Kavita, you're perfect in many ways, so it's a shame that you're not a lawyer as well. We see what we can do. For me, collaboration, I agree with everything that my fellow panelists have said. And I think what I can add to that, it's about connecting the dots as well. Because without collaboration, that's virtually impossible to do. And the thing about connecting the dots is hopefully you get a straight line, and the fastest way between 2 points is a straight line. So if you want to achieve your goals, you're going to need to connect the dots. And for all of us, either as people or for the organizations we work for, there are limits to what we can do and are able to do. And right next door to you is someone else who, where your boundaries end, theirs begin. And by connecting that and that cross-fertilization, that intersectionality is the way forward, because what limits us can also liberate us, because we can move on and work with people around us. And I think that is so important if we actually want to achieve the goals we want to achieve. None of us can be an island in that sense, as you've all said, and we know it all and we can do it all. So without connecting those dots, we just simply won't achieve what we want to achieve. And we've got a lot to learn from each other, and working together is the best way of achieving those goals, those development goals we want to see.
So in the end, I guess what we're saying is collaboration is a way for achieving better outcomes for people. I mean, I guess that's why we do what we do. Maybe now we just share, taking that as a foundation, just share some examples that you have been, you all three have worked on or are working on of these cross-sectional collaborations, And perhaps share with us a success, but maybe also a failure and what you learned from that, because it's still, I think Eddie Hartman's slide of lawyers working with lawyers is still very dominant. So it'd be good to, to share some experiences of where it works, where it didn't work, and what structures and processes we need to really make that work. Can I start with you, Kavita?
Sure. I think it may be helpful to just note that while I'm still aspiring to this sort of, in my next life, we say in India, you can aspire to being something in your next life. But just in all seriousness, I think in my experience, both as a women's rights activist and working for many years in philanthropy, the notion about how we frame justice and the ways in which we think about access to justice have been, for me, always very much defined by also the struggle to be able to really think about what justice means in the most inclusive sense. And that, I think, is an important starting point, because I think the experience of collaboration and how successful or how unsuccessful you are has a lot to do with our also basic understanding of what these terms and the systems associated with those terms actually look like in lived reality. What do I mean by that? In the context of the country in which I grew up in India, we have an impressive Supreme Court. We have many high courts. We have a series of district courts. But the experience of justice is experienced profoundly differently, whether you were born a Dalit or an untouchable in India, whether you were born a woman, whether you were born a member of the minority community, one of many religious minorities in India. And so to say that justice exists in sort of some abstract or neutral sense is just simply not true, because the biases, the structural discrimination, the structural oppression of societies is actually baked into the systems that we call justice or law or human rights. And there is actually a reason why we had to come up with that phrase, women's rights are human rights. If it was so obvious that we were in fact human, we would not have had to come up with that statement. And it is something important to remember, because it is the premise before you get to the point of like what makes for a successful collaboration. So the two examples I would give where we tried something within the space of philanthropy. I was at the Ford Foundation in New Delhi running a number of grant-making programs, and we in particular supported one to be able to have grassroots activists develop skills as what you might call barefoot lawyers. Okay. In the state of Madhya Pradesh, which is a state in the central part of India, a very poor state in many ways, and a real attempt to try and push a lot of decision-making in India. You may have heard that people actually wait for 30 to 40 years for a case to be resolved in India. And partly that's because a lot of the decisions are pushed up to the very high courts. So this was an effort to try and have lower-level district courts make decisions. One small example about what we learned in the process. So the effort was to be able to kind of combine people who had been formally trained as lawyers with people who had basically been taken through a process in which they had been given a kind of a working grasp of what the laws and rights were. And I think a big issue that we learned, and I think you and I were talking about this earlier today, Sam, is that if you don't know what your rights are as a citizen of a country or as a member of society, then it is almost impossible to actually demand that you actually be treated in a certain way within society. And women have had that experience disproportionately. So a vast majority of women in India, if you do a survey or data collection, will say that they think it's perfectly okay to be beaten and to experience domestic violence inside their homes. So the experience that we had with the program on community, grassroots, barefoot lawyers was that they were internalizing many of these attitudes that they had all grown up with. And what actually ended up being required was that they all had to go through a significant unlearning of assumptions that were gendered assumptions, that were just gendered assumptions about everything, about what women's place was inside the family, that women had no right to make a decision about who they married or who they didn't marry, that women could not have sex outside of marriage, that there was prohibitions on how far a woman could go in terms of leaving the home. And I think our experience from that was that it was not simply enough to train people to be paralegals. No. It was profoundly important to do a whole set of sort of cultural conversations to begin to understand that you could not actually have a successful intervention that would benefit the women in those same communities if, in fact, the paralegals who had been trained to respond to particular crises were not appreciative of the fact that women themselves didn't know that they had some of these rights. So
and did you ever come across the fantastic conversation killer that lawyers love? That's not legally relevant.
Oh no, never. I mean, how could we have possibly come across that? Yes, many times. So I think I'll leave it at that, and I'm sure we'll have other colleagues. But I think for me that was
how did you deal with that just quickly? I mean,
well, what we did actually is we completely changed a program that had been very much focused on sort of training paralegals. Ended up working with a local feminist organization, Jagori, and the two organizations came together, and the feminist organization did actual gender trainings together with the paralegal trainings. That was sort of part of kind of looking at traditional roles, traditional assumptions, assumptions about women's sexuality, assumptions about women's freedom and mobility inside those societies that began to help change some of those. A lot of the cases, for example, were about dowry and how dowry gets, so dowry is prohibited by law, but extraordinarily customary practice across India, and leads to high levels of violence inside of homes where women are thought to have brought insufficient dowry into the marriage, including and up to women being killed so that men can marry again and have more dowry.
Thank you. Thuli, a completely different field where you work in. What are your examples of collaborations that have worked or not worked?
Well, given the fact that it is Workers' Day today, International Workers' Day, I thought I could mention collaboration during my days as a trade unionist. And of course, as organizers, some of us were lawyers, some were not lawyers. But the collaboration came in bringing doctors to help with workplace safety, and experts such as engineers to do an analysis of the workplace, including training us on workplace safety and economics that go with that. As a woman also, I've been part of women's struggles in South Africa, but one collaboration that I thought was the most powerful in my lifetime was a process of coming up with a women's charter. Well, there was a women's charter that came in the 60s, in the 50s, that was before my time, but just before the Constitution was drafted, there was a whole process of collaboration across sectors, across political parties, ethnicity, geography, and race that led to a program of what do women want. And when we went to Parliament, as those of us who were lucky to be drafted into the Constitution drafting process, two things happened. One was looking back at what was what were the provisions of the Women's Charter, but secondly, we could draw from strength from that women's group on interpretation. And one of the things that we were very strong about was a substantive equality clause. The second important thing that we came with was, we wanted equality to trump culture and custom. And I was in that committee that drafted that very clause. Unfortunately, we didn't get equality trumping culture, but we said subject to this constitution, which obviously meant that we will respect cultural rights, we will respect customs, provided there is those customs and cultural practices are consistent with the rest of the Constitution. More recently, my work has been all about collaboration. At the South African Law Reform Commission, we started to bring in a multi-sectoral approach. If you're talking about weaknesses in that, is lawyers are so used to working alone. And I remember when I started saying we should hire sociologists and psychologists in the Law Reform Commission, it was tough. And I still don't know after I left if they did continue with that journey. And investigations is also another area where we've done a lot of collaboration across sectors. One of the key areas of collaboration for me was collaboration with journalists without violating freedom of the media. And I was lucky that at the beginning of my term as a public protector, there was a case between one of the newspapers, the Mail and Guardian and the Public Protector, and the Mail and Guardian was suing the Public Protector for failure to find money that had been lost to the state. And this money was given to some company called Imvume to go and buy oil for the state, and the money was stolen. Some of it was given to the governing party. And the Public Protector then had come back with an answer that said, once the money had left the state, there was nothing we could do about it. We couldn't follow it. And the court said, no, as a Public Protector, you've got more powers than the judge when it comes to investigations. And you've got to find the money wherever it is. You've got to keep an open mind, etc. What then the court said was we should have, this case had been decided by my predecessor, we should have had a conversation with the journalist that broke the story. And
Right.
if, of course, the journalist doesn't want to talk, it's a different story. And since then, I remember investigating a particular company and coming back with my team saying there was no wrongdoing. Well, no, we didn't say there was no wrongdoing. We said there was maladministration. We were investigating corruption, and we came back and we said there was maladministration. If you know the investigation sector, if you're accused of corruption and the investigation agency comes back and say you're guilty of maladministration, you say, thank you, God. And you say, well, I accept the decision and I'm going to implement the findings, and that's what I got. So with the first case, we did that. With the second case, the same company changed names, and we investigated it. This time, a journalist had broken the story and had written a book. And following the decision in the Mail and Guardian case, our starting point was to go back to the journalist. Of course, we're not going to replicate what a journalist has said, but the journalist would give us a sense of where are things hiding, what are we looking for, where is it likely to be hiding. And in this particular case, we found that there were back-to-back agreements between the company getting the deal and the company really getting the deal. The company really getting the deal had a relationship with people inside the system. So then you get the decoy company that seems to be getting the deal, but it immediately signs off the work to those who are connected to the state. And we came up with a report called On the Point of Tenders, which basically showed that there were corrupt relationships, and everything that looked good was not good because everything was done by the book. The tender would be advertised, the selection committee would be constituted properly, the bid adjudication committee would be done properly, and finally everything. But you had to read between the lines, and then you would realize that the company that won the tender was actually formed 7 days before the event. If you didn't know that there was smoke, you wouldn't have looked for the fire, and that's journalists. But just lastly, currently we have a project that involves collaboration. It is like the post-World War II Marshall Plan. It's called a Moussa Plan for Social Justice. So it's a Marshall Plan-like project that's seeking to accelerate social justice progress in South Africa. We've done well in improving the quality of life of people, but poverty is at about 55.5% across national groups. Africans who look like me, it's 64.2%, and unemployment very, very high. And what we've found in my research, which I did at Harvard in 2017, was that the biggest problem is dissonance between policy outcomes and policy intentions. So you intend to end inequality, but you don't use predictive data analytics to look at the likely impact of your policy. And therefore, the key result area of the M Plan for Social Justice is leveraging data analytics to plan for inclusivity and to predict really the likely outcome of your policy and make sure how is it going to hit older persons, poor persons, townships, rural areas, etc. Obviously, you need data analytics.
How do you involve lawyers in such a...
Well, of course...
Or the legal sector, I mean, how are they part of that conversation? On the social Marshall Plan?
At the moment, we're involving mostly academics in all universities. Some didn't have social justice centers. Some are in the process of now creating social justice centers. Wits, some of the big universities, Wits, Free State, etc. And the legal profession is going to come on board, but at the moment it's been lawyers. We also have a company that has come on board because part of the project is to create a social justice hub. And therefore, LexisNexis has been the first investor in the social justice hub, which pulls together all research around social justice, but it also becomes a play center, sort of, for social justice experts across the board. And we've been having sort of think tanks or what do you call them, roundtable discussions. And then lastly, as part of that, we planned to create tools for decision makers to look at the likely impact of the policies, particularly your generic policies. But we discovered in the process that our economic policy in South Africa at the moment is very touch and go. It's not very clear. Yeah. And we discovered that through collaboration, we collaborated at looking at a socially just, growing and sustainable economy, and our main partner is the Institute for Sustainability in Stellenbosch University. And we brought together economists from all over the world. I was told by my colleague Mike Swelling, who is driving this process for us from an economic point of view, that some of these economists had never spoken to each other. But my experience, just about what could go wrong, was my experience is that after we'd had the deans come together at my university to just set the ground rules and bring everyone on board, I remember later, I won't say which university, meeting with economists, and my team came out of that room feeling that people were talking at us, and people talked to us as if we were from kindergarten. And then later, when I spoke to my colleague, said that if you think lawyers think they know everything, you haven't met economists.
I see some World Bank people nodding. Yeah.
But once all the egos have been sorted out and nobody worries about who's going to get the credit, things go well. And basically what I've learned works is making sure that the leadership that drives collaboration is ethical, purpose-driven, impact-conscious, and that everyone is committed to serve. And then I also think that what also has worked is various intelligences, we know that intellectual intelligence is extremely important, but emotional intelligence works as well, spiritual intelligence works, and social intelligence. Thank you.
That's very interesting. Thank you, Thuli. Sandie, over to you. What great examples do you have?
Thank you. I won't crack any jokes about economists because I work at the World Bank and it's full of economists, and I want a smooth path when I go back to DC, but I do know what you mean. Before I give an example, let me give a bit of a backstory. So I joined the World Bank in February 2017, having come from the private sector in the UK in financial services. So a very, very different sector completely, not development, not international law. And I got my dream job at the bank as General Counsel. And I think coming in made me look at things slightly differently. So I think previously where perhaps in the legal team we'd looked at things that limited what we could do as an organisation, such as our political prohibition, such as the fact that we only lend to our member countries, and so we only engage with those member countries. There are 180 of them, but we can only engage with our member countries, and our business is to lend money. It doesn't look like that's got anything to do with justice, necessarily. I mean, where does that come in? However, that definitely was not the case, and we have a huge governance team within the bank that does focus on this. But where are those limits? Where do they begin and end? And one of the things that became really obvious to me was that political neutrality and political prohibition, combined with 180 member states, meant we had huge convening power. And that's something the bank has always used. And how could we then use that and leverage off that convening power to really focus on access to justice for women, which I feel particularly passionate about, are women's issues, women's equality. And being the General Counsel, what's the point of having a big fancy title and a big important job if you don't do something important? So I thought, well, how can we use all of this together to try and push this forward and push this access to justice, equality before the law issue forward, which might seem like that is for another organisation to do, but actually it has to be the groundswell of everything that we do within our projects as well. Otherwise, we're not going to get these development outcomes. The two are interconnected, and the bank itself is very keen to weave justice into the projects we're doing, but we're not necessarily connected to all the CSOs and the NGOs that do that. But what I saw was this convening power that we had, and amazing data that we have. We produce a very good report called Women, Business and the Law. And one of the key facts in there that I always think is very interesting, that they look at women's empowerment in economic matters. And out of 180 member countries, only 6 member countries have equality for men and women before the law when it comes to those economic issues. So there's a lot of work to be done. So working with my team and with the governance team within the bank and with the gender team as well, we have this new project called, here's one I prepared earlier, Empowering Women by Balancing the Law, which we launched at our spring meetings. And the idea of that is really very simple. It's to use that convening power to bring together ideas, to work with our member countries, because one of our limitations is we can't tell our member countries what to do, but we can work with them on projects they want to do. And these will be access to justice projects related to women's empowerment that our member countries want to do, but working with many other organisations, looking at the data and also lessons learned. So bringing together a big scope of that to really have impact and outcomes. The genesis of the idea actually started with a project we wanted to do with UN Women. And they recently launched this fabulous project, which is called Equality in the Law for Women and Girls by 2030. And that's about pure policy reform. But for many different reasons, we couldn't do that jointly with them. So rather than, okay, we can't do it, let's leave it, we looked at what is it we can do. And I was very keen that we continued doing, and it's this bringing together, this joining the dots in the middle, because we have this convening power, we've got the data, we've got a wonderful fund called WeFi, which is the Women's Entrepreneur Fund, that at the end of something like that, you can actually have projects that have real impact for women on the ground. And I'm particularly keen to see this happen, because when I go on my missions and I meet many women who are who've been beneficiaries of our projects, they come up to me time and time again, and they'll say to me, can you be our voice? Can you make sure that you talk to our governments to get what we need? Many issues around nationality, for example, and identity, that in many countries women can't pass on their nationality to their children, things like that. And these are real issues. And so when we're looking at things like a big land project, You can easily tie these things in together. You can join those dots, but we need to work with everybody to do that. And so sort of spotting the gap and putting something in between that and, where we have various instruments in the bank that we can use as well. And we're looking at putting that all together, and we put it in this Empowering Women by Balancing the Law. And I think that is so important. We all have our limitations, but actually they can liberate you to see what it is that you can do with others that's really important. And even just that convening power and bringing together our instruments and bringing together the funders and bringing together the ideas and the data and helping on all sorts of projects is really key. So it's a bit of a sort of a glue in between. In terms of things that I've seen that haven't worked well, I'm just going to bring in my private sector experience and just say something really obvious. When I left the dark side and came into the light in development, it was a huge learning curve for me. Not just from the legal side, but also from the development side. And what I realized, this is a whole different world on this side. And it's a very big world. In fact, in many ways, it's almost as big as the private sector world. But the private sector has no idea, really, what goes on in this world. And I think, and a really simple example is if you go to the private sector and say, go to a legal team that think they know everything, because we do, but anyway, and say, can you give me 3 sustainable development goals? They wouldn't be able to. They wouldn't know what you meant by sustainable development goal. So I think one of the things we can really do is really leverage off the private sector more to help us with these development goals. Because really big private sector institutions are in the same places we are in. And there may be some challenges they've already looked at and overcome or can help us with. So one of the things at the bank that we've been doing quite a bit of work on is an ID. And of course, working with financial services companies who ID is a core part of what they do in terms of giving people access to banking. You can see all of that, but I don't think they've seen it from a development perspective. So I think that sort of thing, is what I would say where I haven't seen it working well and could work much better, and we're looking at that at the bank as well. But we need to not forget to invite the private sector to the things that we do, because I don't think they're aware of how that part of the puzzle fits together.
Thank you, Sandie.
Thank you.
So I kind of distill seven things out of this conversation. One, the importance of data about the problem, data about context, data about impact, data about outcomes. That it's important to have like servile leadership. So when you are collaborating, don't claim the credit. Be a leader that serves. You mentioned the importance of ethics. Ethics in a collaboration. I love the various intelligences that you need. I think we've all come across that. The demand-driven aspect of not, talking to, but taking time to listen. Sandie, the point of communication across sectors, so bringing in, telling the private sector about the SDGs, and just making sure you communicate, and not with your own little pillar. We have about 5 or 7 or 6 or 8 minutes left. I'm looking at
I think 10.
Betsy, 10. Maybe this is a good moment just to open the floor and see if, from experiences in the room, there may be an 8th or 9th or 10th lesson that we can distill, or there may be questions that somebody has to the panel. Anybody out there? I see way at the back. I don't know whether there are roaming microphones. Yes? Yeah. I'll give you the floor there. Yeah, please briefly state your name and your question.
Good morning. My name is Kristen Hope, and I work with Terre des Hommes. We're a Swiss child protection and child rights agency. Thank you so much to the 3 panelists for their inspiring words. I also love seeing an all-women panel. My question is, when we talk about collaboration, how can we engage with some of those who are often the least involved? Kavita, you spoke of things related to class, but I think that also age is a fundamental factor. When we look across the room, we realize that there may be no children here, or very little people may be considered as youth under the age of 25, when we know that these are the people who will be taking forward the Sustainable Development Goals, when we also know that between now and 2030, almost 1 billion more children will be born, who will be living in the post-2030 world, and who we hope our work here will serve. We're going to be talking about this a little bit more in session 4 on justice for children, where we're working with partners on this. But I wanted to hear from you if you had any ideas about how we can bring those crucial voices into our conversations. Thank you.
Yep, let's go. Kavita.
Thank you so much for that question. And we haven't used the word movements here, but I guess I would really like to put on the table one form of cross-sector collaboration in my mind is doing a much better job thinking about interacting with social justice movements. And I think young people and children are actually leading some of the most exciting social justice movements of our time, whether that's around climate change, whether that's around questions of gun control in the United States, whether it's around questions of labor in many parts of India, for example. So I think your question is an incredibly important one, and one way for us to think about how we bring those voices to the table is actually, those voices are not waiting for us to give them the invitation, number one. They are like organizing, mobilizing. You saw them shutting down London a couple of weeks ago. You see Greta standing in front of the Swedish Parliament every Friday across the United States. It has been young people's activism that has put the National Rifle Association of the United States on notice that things are not just business as usual. So I think one thing for us to recognize is that actually, since we have not done such a great job of inviting those voices to formal gatherings like this, they've actually created their own spaces which are forcing us to actually pay attention and pay notice. So I think one thing I would like to suggest is that as we think about cross-sector collaboration, we think very consciously about ways in which we engage with social movements that are not led by the usual actors, that are being led by people who are considerably younger than us, who have different kinds of expertise, different kinds of experience, but also to understand that what we build then is more of an intergenerational learning process, rather than assuming that any one of us has the answers. It's true for all kinds of collaboration, and there as well, we have much to teach and learn from each other.
Thuli.
Thank you. The one area where we've brought marginalized voices into the party is a project that we're doing in South Africa called Enterprising Communities. It's the other side of the M plan, and it is specifically focusing on SDGs and national goals. It's about translating global and national goals into local goals. And we're going to villages. Okay, it's a pilot at this stage. We have a village that has 26 villages. The people there are about almost 1 million. They'd never heard about the SDGs, etc. And the idea, what we've been doing is just telling them what SDGs are, what the national goals are, and letting them dream. They might not use our language, but people know what they want for their future. And once we've given them the fancy language of SDGs and national goals, they're able to say for ourselves, what do we want? And, but there comes another complexity of collaborating with people that have their own way of life and a simple way of life. We came there, we wanted them to dream about the future. The place is called Emanzimeleni. So we came with our big ideas, Emanzimeleni 2030, let's do it the way Kunshan, a Chinese city, did it, dream and then pathways. And they were clear that until you've sorted out what we think are our problems, we're not going to go into that. And they wanted a clinic, they wanted a police station, they wanted roads, they wanted an agriculture process. So again, we learned that if you're going to collaborate, you might have a fixed idea of where you're going, but you need flexibility. Because in a collaborative atmosphere, there should be what's in it for me, for everyone. And I think that should be put on the table up front, and then we all move backwards and forwards until the what's in it for me meets you what's in it for you, and then we all move together forward. Another, regarding the social movements, you've got an important point there. Social movements are not going to wait for us when it comes to the issue of poverty and inequality. They're moving forward, but sadly they're moving forward in a manner that is both destructive to themselves and to us. We've had the fees must fall in South Africa. People know that in the end it solved part of the problem, but what people don't know is the devastation it has left in the lives of the students who are involved, the mental health challenges, the children in jail, the young people in jail, etc. So with us, I have another organization that I'm involved in. It's called Tumor Foundation. It's a democracy, literacy, and leadership. And that's where we really are into working together with all of the legacy foundations like Mandela Foundation, Begi Foundation, Tutu Foundation, Sisulu, etc., Tambo Foundations, etc. And a lot of them are looking at how do you harness the already existing leadership of young people. That's a bit raw, but put them into training programs on how do you lead effectively in a manner that takes society forward. It doesn't just push forward on the one issue that you're concerned about, but has unintended consequences that destroy your own life, but also destroys the world you want to live in.
Thank you, Thuli. Sandie, would you mind if I frame the question a little bit with you? Because in my 7 things, I realized I forgot one, which is the one you mentioned on convening power, how important that is. And when you think about these voices that are not being heard, that there'd be 2 areas where, at least from the bank perspective, I would think you might have some wisdom to add. Is first the convening power. God, can we convene those voices? In the Netherlands, for example, Princess Laurentien, one of our princesses here, has led a movement of creating children councils. And she's basically telling all big companies to have councils of children, and that the CEOs and the management teams of those companies should listen to those children and meet with those councils at least twice a year to kind of know whether they're doing the right thing. So the convening power. And the second one is data. One of the things, we collect a lot of data. And one of the things I actually realize is that we only collect data of 18 years old and above. We have very little justice data on the justice needs, for example, of children. And 80 and above, I don't think we have a lot of data about that either. So maybe on those 2 points, the convening power and just knowing what's out there in terms of the data, would you have any thoughts?
Thank you. I think you read my mind on that one. Because I was going to go, Kirsten, thank you for your great question. I was going to go to the convening power aspect of what we do. And we do convene those voices because we can in many different ways, both, in situ and locally, and bringing them to DC as well. And I'll give you an example. Our office in Kenya last year ran a blog for development where young people, I think between the ages of 18 and 25, had to blog on a subject, and that was submitted to the bank. And the subject was gender-based violence. And some terrific pieces were submitted, absolutely terrific. And they were so good, we thought we would bring those bloggers that won to DC to meet the vice presidents who are in charge of that region and in charge of other things, to talk to them directly, because that's what we can do, and we were able to do that. So they were part of our annual meetings, and I held a lunch with them, and part of what they were saying is what has inspired me to do our Empowering Women and Balancing the Law, particularly 2 young men who talked about their own experience of watching their mothers be at the receiving end of domestic-based violence from their fathers, and the effect that this has on young men growing up. And that was very, very powerful. And we also used that, some of their thoughts as well, and we took one of the bloggers to a gender and judiciary conference that the bank had put together in Arusha in Tanzania, where we had judges and mainly chief justices, actually, from many of the sub-Saharan African countries. They listened to one of these bloggers' stories about her being at the receiving end of being raped by someone she knew and how she was treated in court. And actually hearing that, not in the sense that you're hearing it in court, but you're hearing the story, had such a powerful impact that some of the judges went back and wanted to look at the way these things are dealt with. So that youth voice can have such a huge impact, and what we can do is our convening power to bring that together, to give them access to those decision makers so they can listen to what they have to say. I think the other thing that is really important about data, so one of the things the bank has just launched is their Human Capital Index. Now, that's not on a justice side of things, but is actually looking at data from 0 to 18 in relation to a number of things, but particularly interesting is sort of access to health and education in our member countries for children between 0 to 18. Now, we've just launched that, and we're looking at that in many areas, but it gives you an index of you know, how that youth is going to then perform in your society, in your country, given what you put into them between 0 to 18. And that is based on data from every single their own member country. And it's the first time that has really been done in such a wide way. But that is so interesting because that is focusing just on 0 to 18. And you can really see what countries are putting in and what they get out as a result. And the top of that index was Singapore.
Thank you very much. Well, with that, we come to the end. So maybe I could try and summarize once again what I would then call the 7 habits of great collaboration that came out of this fantastic panel. It's not the truth, but it may be something. So 1, use data about the problem, context, impact, outcomes. 2, don't claim credit, but serve. 3, be ethical. 4, use various intelligences. Build and develop convening power. Work demand-driven, don't talk to, but listen. And communicate across sectors, tell stories. Maybe that's a good way to end. Thank you very much. And before we close, I have been explicitly asked to tell you that you must go straight to your next session. Straight to your next session, where you will get coffee. So the coffee will be in your next session. So don't stop for coffee, go straight to your next session. And let me thank this wonderful panel for their great contribution. Thank you.